Elena Rodriguez sat in her cold prison cell, staring at a letter that would change everything. After 30 long years behind bars for a murder she didn't commit, 4 words on a piece of paper made her hands tremble for the first time in decades. We never forgot you. But who were the 4? And how could 4 strangers possibly help a woman the justice system had already forgotten? Elena's story begins not in this maximum security prison, but in 1987, when she was just 17 years old, with graying black hair that once shone like midnight, and eyes that sparkled with the kind of kindness that could light up the darkest room. Those same eyes now stared blankly at concrete walls, worn down by 3 decades of fighting a system that had already decided her fate. Elena Rodriguez had lost everything twice in her young life. First, when she was 16 and a drunk driver took her parents in a head-on collision, leaving her completely alone in the world. She dropped out of high school, worked 3 jobs just to keep a roof over her head, and spent most nights crying herself to sleep in a tiny apartment that smelled like mold and broken dreams. The second time she lost everything was the night that would define the rest of her life. But before we get to that devastating night, you need to understand who Elena really was. Because the woman who would spend 30 years in prison was the same 17-year-old who worked the graveyard shift at Mel's Diner in one of the roughest neighborhoods in the city. Every night from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., she served coffee to truck drivers, comfort food to night workers, and hope to anyone who walked through those glass doors. Elena barely made enough to survive. She ate leftover fries and day-old bread for most meals, wore the same 3 uniforms every week, and counted every penny twice before spending it. But despite having almost nothing, Elena had something that money couldn't buy: a heart that recognized pain in others because she had felt it herself. It was 2 a.m. on a Tuesday night in November when 4 teenagers pushed through the diner's heavy glass door. They were dirty, exhausted, and clearly hadn't eaten in days. David Thompson, 16 years old, was the obvious leader of the group. An African-American kid with eyes that had seen too much too young. Jenny Wu, barely 15, stayed quiet but watched everything with the sharp intelligence of someone who had learned to survive by paying attention. Tommy Martinez was 17, a Latino kid who would later realize he was Elena's distant cousin, though neither of them knew it that night. And Lisa Chen, 16 and mixed race, carried a worn sketchbook that held all her dreams of a better life. These 4 kids had been living on the streets for months. They had pooled together every penny they could find. Spare change from fountain wishes, coins found between couch cushions, a crumpled dollar bill discovered in a parking lot. Together, they had exactly $3.47. David approached the counter with the kind of pride that comes from trying to maintain dignity when you have nothing left. "Excuse me, miss," he said to Elena. "We know this isn't much, but could we maybe share one meal? We're really hungry." Elena looked at these 4 kids, really looked at them. She saw herself 2 years ago, alone and desperate. She saw the way Jenny's hands shook from hunger. She saw how Lisa tried to hide her face behind her long hair, embarrassed by their situation. She saw Tommy's worn-out shoes with holes that let in the cold November air. Elena also knew that giving away free food could cost her the job she desperately needed. Her manager, Mr. Peterson, had fired 2 other waitresses just that month for giving handouts. One mistake, and Elena would be back on the streets herself. But as she looked at these 4 teenagers, Elena made a decision that would ripple through time in ways she could never imagine. Instead of one shared meal, Elena brought them everything: burgers, fries, milkshakes, pie, soup, sandwiches. She set plate after plate in front of their amazed faces. When David tried to give her their $3.47, Elena gently pushed his hand away. "Keep your money," she said with a smile that reached her tired eyes, "and take this with you." She packed bags full of sandwiches, fruit, and cookies. "Sometimes angels don't have wings," she told them quietly. "They just have good hearts." The 4 teenagers ate like they hadn't seen food in weeks, because they hadn't. As they prepared to leave, David looked Elena in the eyes and made a promise. "We'll never forget what you did for us tonight. Never." Jenny nodded solemnly. Tommy wiped tears from his eyes. Lisa quickly sketched Alina's face in her worn notebook, capturing the kindness that radiated from this young woman who had given them everything when she had almost nothing herself. That act of kindness would save Alina's life 30 years later, though she had no way of knowing it as she watched 4 grateful teenagers disappear into the cold November night. Because 3 months later, Elena's world would collapse in the most devastating way possible. If this story is already giving you chills, hit that subscribe button, because what happens next will completely blow your mind, and you won't want to miss how 4 strangers become Elena's only hope for freedom. Elena's daily routine in Millfield Correctional Facility had become as predictable as sunrise. Wake up at 5 a.m. to the harsh sound of metal doors sliding open. Stand for count. Eat breakfast that tasted like cardboard. Work in the prison laundry for 8 hours. Eat dinner alone. Lights out at 9 p.m. Repeat for 30 years, 2 months, and 14 days. But the letter that arrived on a Tuesday morning in March shattered that routine forever. The envelope had no return address, just her name written in careful handwriting, Elena Rodriguez, inmate number 47291. Inside, a single sheet of paper with words that made her heart race for the first time since 1987. We never forgot what you did for us. It's time we return the favor. The 4. Elena's hands trembled as she read those words again and again. Could it really be them? The 4 teenagers from Mel's diner? After all these years? You see, Elena had been convicted of first-degree murder in 1987 for the death of her ex-boyfriend, Carlos Mendez. The prosecution painted her as a jealous, violent woman who killed Carlos in a fit of rage. But the truth was far more complex and infinitely more tragic. Carlos had been abusive throughout their relationship. Elena had tried to leave him multiple times, but he always found her, always convinced her to come back, always promised to change. The night he died, Elena had finally gathered the courage to end things permanently. She came home from her shift at the diner to find Carlos dead in her apartment, stabbed multiple times. Elena did what any innocent person would do. She called 911, tried to help him, waited for the police. But Detective Ray Morrison, the lead investigator, had already made up his mind the moment he saw Elena covered in Carlos's blood from trying to save his life. The investigation was rushed, sloppy, and biased. Elena's court-appointed attorney, fresh out of law school and overwhelmed with cases, barely put up a defense. The prosecutor, D.A. Michael Cross, was an ambitious young man who saw Elena's case as his ticket to higher office. A poor Latina woman accused of murder? The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before finding her guilty. Elena maintained her innocence throughout the trial, through the appeals, through the first decade in prison. But slowly, year by year, hope had died inside her. The system had failed her completely. Her few friends had moved on. She had no family left to fight for her, until now. Until 4 people she had helped as a 17-year-old waitress decided it was time to help her. But here's what Elena didn't know as she clutched that letter. David Thompson had become one of the most successful defense attorneys in the state. Jenny Wu had built a reputation as an investigative journalist who specialized in exposing corruption. Tommy Martinez had worked his way up to detective, driven by a deep sense of justice that began the night a kind waitress showed him what compassion looked like. And Lisa Chen had won awards for her documentary films that shed light on social injustices. Each of them had been shaped by Elena's kindness 30 years ago. And now they were about to use everything they had learned, everything they had built, to give Elena back the life that had been stolen from her. The investigation that would change Elena's life forever was about to begin. But first, these 4 adults had to find each other again, piece together a decades-old conspiracy, and race against time to save a woman who had already lost the best years of her life to a system that had failed her from the very beginning. David Thompson sat in his corner office on the 32nd floor of downtown's most prestigious law firm, reviewing case files that would determine the fate of his clients. His walls were lined with awards, degrees from Harvard Law, and photographs with governors and senators. At 46 years old, he had everything a poor kid from the streets could have dreamed of: wealth, respect, power. But none of it had erased the memory of a 17-year-old waitress who had shown him kindness when the world had shown him nothing but cruelty. His phone rang on a Thursday afternoon in March. The caller ID showed a name he hadn't seen in 15 years. Jenny Wu. David? It's Jenny. Jenny Wu. I know it's been forever, but I found something you need to see. It's about the waitress from Mel's Diner. Jenny Wu had built her career on one simple principle. The truth always leaves a trail, no matter how hard people try to bury it. As an investigative journalist for the Chicago Tribune, she had exposed corrupt politicians, dirty cops, and corporate cover-ups. Her Pulitzer Prize sat on her desk as a reminder that sometimes one person with determination could change everything. For months, Jenny had been researching wrongful convictions for a series she was writing about flaws in the justice system. She had stumbled across a case that made her blood run cold. Elena Rodriguez, convicted of murder in 1987, still serving life in Millfield Correctional Facility. The name Elena Rodriguez meant nothing to most people, but to Jenny, it was the name of an angel. I've been digging into her case for weeks, Jenny told David over the phone. The conviction was a sham, rushed investigation, planted evidence, witnesses who disappeared after testifying. David, this is the woman who saved our lives. Within hours, David had dropped everything and was sitting across from Jenny in a small cafe, staring at police files and court documents that told the story of a system that had failed Elena Rodriguez in every possible way. We need to find Tommy and Lisa, David said, his voice thick with emotion. If Elena is still alive, if she's still in prison, we owe her everything. Tommy Martinez had become Detective Martinez 15 years ago, driven by a simple belief that justice should protect the innocent, not destroy them. That belief had been born on a cold November night when a teenage waitress had shown him that goodness still existed in the world. He was reviewing cold cases in his precinct when David's call came through. Tommy, it's David Thompson, from the streets, from Mel's Diner. The silence on the phone stretched for 30 seconds before Tommy whispered, "The waitress? Elena. Oh my God, what happened to her?" Lisa Chen had won 3 Emmy Awards for her documentaries about social justice. Her films had changed laws, freed innocent people, and given voices to the voiceless. Every project she chose was inspired by a single night when a young woman had taught her that one person's compassion could light up the darkness. When David's assistant called Lisa's production company, Lisa dropped everything. She canceled meetings with Netflix executives, postponed interviews with A-list celebrities, and booked the first flight to Chicago. The 4 of them met in David's conference room on a rainy Saturday morning. 33 years had passed since they had sat together as hungry, desperate teenagers. Now they were successful adults, a prominent defense attorney, a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, a decorated detective, and an award-winning filmmaker. But as they looked at each other across that polished conference table, they were children again, united by a debt they had never forgotten. She gave us everything, Lisa said, tears already flowing down her cheeks. When she had nothing, she gave us everything, and we let her rot in prison for 30 years. We didn't know, Tommy said, his detective's composure cracking. How could we have known? It doesn't matter how, David said firmly. What matters is what we do now. Elena Rodriguez saved our lives. Now we save hers. Each of them revealed how that night at Mel's Diner had shaped their entire future. David had been inspired to study law because he wanted to protect people like Elena, people who showed kindness to strangers. Jenny had become a journalist because she wanted to uncover truth for those who had no voice. Tommy had joined the police force because he wanted to be the kind of officer who would have believed Elena's story. Lisa had dedicated her career to telling stories about injustice because she knew that sometimes good people get destroyed by systems that don't care about the truth. Elena's kindness had created 4 careers dedicated to justice. Now those careers would be used to save Elena herself. Jenny had already done weeks of research, and what she had found was sickening. The original investigation was led by Detective Ray Morrison. He's retired now, living in Florida, but the case files show massive irregularities, evidence that went missing, witnesses who changed their stories, a crime scene that was processed so poorly it would embarrass a first-year cadet. Tommy studied the police reports with the eye of someone who had spent 20 years investigating murders. "These inconsistencies aren't just sloppy work," he said grimly. "This is deliberate. Someone wanted Elena convicted, and they didn't care about the truth." David examined the court transcripts and legal filings. The prosecutor was DA Michael Cross. He built his entire political career on high-profile convictions. He's a judge now, been on the bench for 20 years. Elena's case was one of his first major wins. Lisa was already planning how to document everything. "We need to interview everyone who's still alive. The witnesses, the investigators, anyone who was involved in Elena's case. Someone knows the truth." But as they dug deeper into Elena's case, they uncovered something far more sinister than incompetence or ambition. They uncovered a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of law enforcement and the justice system. Jenny's investigation revealed that Detective Morrison had been receiving payments from unknown sources during the time he was investigating Elena's case. Bank records showed deposits that didn't match his salary, deposits that came from shell companies and disappeared into offshore accounts. Tommy's examination of the evidence locker revealed that key pieces of physical evidence had been destroyed years ago, destroyed by Morrison himself, claiming they were contaminated and useless. David discovered that DA Cross had been in possession of information that could have exonerated Elena, information he had buried to secure his conviction and advance his career. The truth that emerged was devastating. Elena's ex-boyfriend, Carlos Mendez, had been involved with a local gang that controlled drug distribution in their neighborhood. Carlos had been stealing money from the gang, and they had decided to eliminate him. The killer was Carlos's associate in the gang, a man named Rico Velasquez. Rico had murdered Carlos in Elena's apartment, knowing that Elena would be the obvious suspect. Detective Morrison had been on the gang's payroll for years, taking money to look the other way on drug crimes. When Rico killed Carlos, Morrison saw an opportunity to close the case quickly and please his real employers. Morrison had destroyed evidence that would have pointed to Rico. He had coached witnesses to lie about seeing Elena argue with Carlos. He had rushed the investigation and pressured Elena's inexperienced public defender to accept a plea deal. DA Cross had known about Carlos's gang connections because the police had been investigating the gang for months. Cross had evidence that Rico was the real killer, but he buried it because convicting Elena was easier and would boost his political career. Rico Velasquez had died in a gang shootout 5 years after Elena's conviction. He took the truth to his grave, never knowing that an innocent woman was spending her life in prison for his crime. If you're feeling the same outrage we are right now, make sure to hit that subscribe button, because what these 4 friends discover next will make your blood boil. And you need to see how they're going to fight a system that destroyed an innocent woman's life. The witnesses who had testified against Elena had been threatened by the gang and coached by Morrison. Maria Santos, who claimed she saw Elena arguing violently with Carlos, later recanted her testimony to a priest, saying she had lied because Morrison told her that Elena was dangerous and would hurt other people if she wasn't convicted. Jose Ramirez, who testified that Elena had threatened to kill Carlos, had been arrested on drug charges the week before the trial. Morrison offered to make those charges disappear if Jose testified against Elena. The forensic evidence that should have cleared Elena had been mishandled deliberately. Blood spatter patterns that would have shown Elena couldn't have committed the murder were never properly analyzed. DNA evidence was contaminated in the lab before it could be tested. For 30 years, Elena Rodriguez had been paying for a crime committed by a dead gang member, prosecuted by a corrupt district attorney, and investigated by a detective who was more concerned with pleasing his criminal employers than finding the truth. But Elena's nightmare was about to end. Because 4 people who owed her everything were about to use everything they had learned, everything they had built, and everything they had become to tear down the lies that had stolen her life. The question wasn't whether they could prove Elena's innocence anymore. The question was whether they could do it before the system that had failed her found a way to silence them too. The moment Detective Ray Morrison heard that four strangers were asking questions about the Elena Rodriguez case, he knew his comfortable retirement was about to become a nightmare. Morrison had spent 15 years living in a beachfront condo in Florida, funded by the money he had taken to destroy an innocent woman's life. Now, 30 years later, his past was catching up to him. Morrison's first move was to discredit the four people who threatened to expose him. He contacted his old friends still working in law enforcement, spinning a story about four delusional adults who were making up elaborate fantasies about a convicted murderer. "These people are obsessed," Morrison told anyone who would listen. "They've created some sick fantasy where they're heroes saving an innocent woman. Elena Rodriguez is a cold-blooded killer, and these four are either lying or mentally unstable." Morrison reached out to reporters, trying to plant stories about David's past cases, suggesting he had a history of taking on hopeless causes for publicity. He spread rumors about Jenny's mental health, claiming she had become obsessed with conspiracy theories. He contacted Tommy's superiors, suggesting that Detective Martinez was compromising active investigations with his delusions about Elena's case. But Morrison's biggest ally in stopping the investigation was someone with far more power than a retired detective, Judge Michael Cross. Cross had built a 30-year career on the conviction of Elena Rodriguez. He had parlayed that early success as a prosecutor into a judgeship, a position that had made him wealthy and powerful. Cross had political ambitions that reached all the way to the governor's mansion, and he wasn't about to let four strangers destroy everything he had built. Using his influence as a respected judge, Cross began making phone calls. He contacted the editors at Jenny's newspaper, suggesting that she was pursuing a frivolous story that could damage the paper's reputation. He reached out to David's law firm partners, implying that David's involvement in the Elena Rodriguez case could bring unwanted scrutiny to their practice. Cross used his connections in the police department to launch an internal investigation into Tommy's conduct, claiming that Detective Martinez was sharing confidential information with unauthorized civilians. He contacted the film festival boards, where Lisa's documentaries were featured, suggesting that her upcoming project was based on fabricated evidence and conspiracy theories. The pressure was immediate and devastating. Jenny's editor pulled her off the Elena Rodriguez story, telling her that the paper couldn't risk a lawsuit from Judge Cross. David's law firm partners called an emergency meeting, strongly suggesting that he drop his involvement in the case if he wanted to remain a partner. Tommy found himself facing a formal reprimand and possible suspension from the police force. Lisa discovered that 3 different film festivals had suddenly reconsidered their interest in her documentary about Elena's case. But the cruelest retaliation was saved for Elena herself. Word of the investigation had somehow leaked into Millfield Correctional Facility. Elena, who had kept to herself for 30 years, suddenly found herself the target of inmates who saw her as a troublemaker. Prison guards, many of whom had worked at the facility for decades and respected the original conviction, began treating Elena with open hostility. Elena's already limited privileges were revoked. She was moved to a smaller, more isolated cell. Her phone calls were restricted, and her mail was delayed or lost by prison officials. Other inmates, encouraged by guards who saw Elena as a problem, began targeting her with harassment and threats. For 30 years, Elena had survived in prison by being invisible, by causing no trouble, by accepting her fate with quiet dignity. Now, at age 47, she was being punished for something she had no control over: 4 people trying to save her life. The stress was unbearable. Elena, who had endured 3 decades of imprisonment with remarkable strength, began to crack under the pressure. She stopped eating regularly, lost weight she couldn't afford to lose, and developed a persistent cough that the prison medical staff ignored. When David finally managed to visit Elena in person, he barely recognized the woman who had saved his life 30 years ago. Elena sat across from him in the prison visiting room, her hands shaking, her eyes empty of the hope that had briefly returned when she received their letter. "You need to stop," Elena whispered, her voice barely audible. "All of you need to stop." David leaned forward, his heart breaking at the sight of the woman who had shown him kindness when no one else would. "Elena, we're so close. We have evidence that can free you. We just need a little more time." Elena shook her head slowly. "I'm tired, David. I've been tired for 30 years. I don't want you to risk your careers, your families, your lives for me. It's not worth it." "You are worth it," David said firmly. "You saved our lives. You gave us everything when you had nothing." Elena's eyes filled with tears, the first tears she had allowed herself to shed in years. "I tried to kill myself twice in here," she whispered, the words coming out like a confession she had never made to anyone. "Once in my 2nd year, once in my 15th. The only thing that stopped me was thinking that maybe, somewhere, you 4 had grown up to be good people. That maybe the kindness I showed you had meant something." David felt like he had been punched in the chest. This woman, this angel who had saved 4 homeless teenagers, had been so broken by the system that she had tried to end her own life. "I've been dead for 30 years already," Elena continued, her voice hollow. "Whatever happens to me now doesn't matter. But you 4, you have lives, families, futures. Don't destroy everything you've built for someone who's already gone." David reached across the table and took Elena's hands in his. "You're not gone. You're not dead. And we're not giving up on you. Not now, not ever." But as David left the prison that day, he wondered if they were already too late. The system that had destroyed Elena 30 years ago was trying to destroy her again. And this time, it was also trying to destroy the 4 people who were fighting to save her. The obstacles seemed impossible to overcome. Morrison had allies throughout law enforcement. Cross had influence that reached into every corner of the legal system. The 4 friends were facing professional ruin, personal threats, and the very real possibility that their efforts to save Elena would only make her suffering worse. But they had underestimated something crucial: the power of people who owe their lives to someone else, and the determination that comes from finally being able to repay a debt of kindness. David called an emergency meeting of the 4 friends. They met in his home office on a Sunday night, all of them exhausted, all of them facing pressure to abandon Elena's case. "They think they can stop us by threatening our careers," David said, his voice filled with quiet rage. "They think they can silence us by making us afraid." Jenny nodded, her jaw set with determination. "I've been threatened before. Corrupt politicians, dirty cops, corporate executives, they all use the same playbook. Fear, intimidation, professional sabotage." Tommy had arrived at the meeting knowing that his police career was probably over. His superiors had made it clear that continuing his involvement in Elena's case would result in his dismissal. "I became a cop because of what Elena taught me that night. That good people deserve protection. If I lose my badge protecting her, then I was a real cop right up to the end." Lisa had been documenting everything, creating a record of the intimidation and threats they were all facing. This is bigger than just Elena now. They're proving that the system is still corrupt, still willing to destroy innocent people to protect itself. David looked at his 3 friends, these people who had shared the most important moment of his childhood, and made a decision that would change all their lives. "You gave us life when we had nothing. Now we give you yours back," he said, echoing the promise Elena had inspired in all of them. "We don't stop. We don't compromise. We don't let them intimidate us into abandoning the woman who saved our lives." The 4 friends began working around the clock, knowing that their window of opportunity was closing. Jenny quit her job at the Tribune and began working as a freelance journalist, publishing her investigation into Elena's case on independent news websites and social media platforms. Her articles about the corruption in Elena's case began gaining traction, shared by activists, lawyers, and ordinary people who were outraged by the injustice. Tommy made the hardest decision of his career. He leaked key evidence from Elena's case to the media, knowing that doing so would end his law enforcement career, but also knowing that it was the only way to get the truth out. The evidence Tommy released showed clear proof of Morrison's tampering with the investigation and Cross's knowledge of Elena's innocence. Lisa's documentary about Elena's case was rejected by every major film festival and streaming platform, but she didn't give up. She released the film online, making it free for anyone to watch. Within weeks, the Elena Rodriguez story, 30 Years of Injustice, had been viewed millions of times and shared across social media platforms. David liquidated his retirement fund and took out loans against his home to fund Elena's legal defense. He assembled a team of the best appellate attorneys in the country, forensic experts who could reanalyze the physical evidence, and investigators who could track down witnesses who had been intimidated into silence 30 years ago. The four friends were risking everything: their careers, their financial security, their reputations, their safety. They were facing opponents with unlimited resources and decades of experience in covering up their crimes. But they had something their opponents didn't have. They had the memory of a 17-year-old waitress who had taught them that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is show kindness to a stranger. And they had each other. What would you be willing to sacrifice to save someone who had saved your life? Your career? Your financial security? Your safety? Let me know in the comments, because these four friends are about to prove that some debts can never be repaid. Only paid forward. The morning of Elena's evidentiary hearing, the courthouse steps were packed with protesters, journalists, and supporters who had been following her story through Lisa's documentary and Jenny's articles. News vans lined the street, reporters practiced their opening statements, and social media buzzed with hashtags like #FreeElena and Justice for 30 Years. Inside courtroom 7B, every seat was filled. Elena Rodriguez, wearing civilian clothes for the first time in 30 years, sat beside David and his legal team. Her hands shook as she looked around at the crowd of strangers who had come to support her. People who knew her story, people who believed in her innocence, people who had been outraged by the corruption that had stolen her life. For 30 years, Elena had faced the justice system alone, with only an overwhelmed public defender who barely knew her name. Now, she was surrounded by the best legal minds in the state, all working for free, all determined to right a wrong that had been festering for 3 decades. Judge Patricia Wells, who had been assigned to oversee the hearing, had spent weeks reviewing the new evidence presented by David's team. The physical evidence, the witness testimony, the proof of corruption. It painted a picture of systematic failure and deliberate misconduct that shocked even a veteran judge who thought she had seen everything. David stood to present the first piece of evidence: DNA results from blood samples that Tommy had secretly preserved from the original crime scene. The samples had been stored in Tommy's personal evidence locker for 30 years, protected from the corruption that had destroyed so much of the original evidence. "Your Honor," David announced, his voice carrying across the packed courtroom. Modern DNA analysis of blood samples from the crime scene conclusively excludes Elena Rodriguez as the perpetrator of this murder. The blood on the murder weapon belongs to Carlos Mendez and an unknown male, a male whose DNA matches samples found in the apartment but was never tested by the original investigators. The courtroom erupted in whispers and gasps. Elena's eyes filled with tears as she heard, for the first time in 30 years, scientific proof of what she had always known: she was innocent. But the DNA evidence was just the beginning. Jenny had spent months tracking down Maria Santos, the witness whose testimony had been crucial in Elena's conviction. Maria, now a grandmother living in Arizona, had agreed to fly to Chicago to finally tell the truth about what had happened 30 years ago. Maria took the witness stand with tears already streaming down her face. "I lied," she said, her voice breaking as she looked directly at Elena. "Detective Morrison told me that Elena was a dangerous woman who would hurt other people if she wasn't stopped. He said that if I didn't testify against her, innocent people would die." The courtroom was silent as Maria continued her testimony. "Morrison showed me pictures of other women who had been murdered, said Elena had killed them too. He said I was the only one who could stop her from killing again. I was 19 years old, I was scared, and I believed him." Maria's voice grew stronger as she continued. "But I never saw Elena arguing with her boyfriend that night. I never saw her threaten anyone. Morrison coached me on what to say, made me practice my testimony over and over until I could say it convincingly. I've lived with this lie for 30 years, and I can't live with it anymore." The impact of Maria's testimony was devastating to the prosecution's case, but David wasn't finished. He had saved the most explosive evidence for last. "Your Honor, I call Detective Ray Morrison to the stand." Morrison entered the courtroom, flanked by his own attorneys, his face pale and his hands trembling. The retired detective had been subpoenaed to testify, and despite his lawyer's advice to take the Fifth Amendment, Morrison knew that staying silent would only make him look more guilty. Under David's relentless cross-examination, Morrison's decades-old lies began to crumble. David presented bank records showing mysterious deposits into Morrison's accounts during the time of Elena's investigation. He showed evidence of Morrison's connections to the gang that Carlos Mendez had been stealing from. He demonstrated how Morrison had deliberately mishandled evidence and coached witnesses. "Detective Morrison," David said, his voice filled with controlled fury, "did you or did you not receive payment from members of Carlos Mendez's gang to ensure that Elena Rodriguez was convicted of his murder?" Morrison's lawyers objected, but the damage was already done. Morrison sat in stunned silence for 30 seconds, his career and reputation crumbling before his eyes. Finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, he spoke the words that would free Elena Rodriguez. "Yes, I took money to frame her." The courtroom exploded. Reporters frantically typed on their phones, spectators gasped and shouted, and Elena collapsed into David's arms, sobbing with 30 years of pain and relief. Morrison's confession opened the floodgates. Under continued questioning, he admitted to destroying physical evidence, threatening witnesses, and working with the gang to ensure that Elena would be convicted quickly and quietly. He revealed that Rico Velasquez, the gang member who had actually murdered Carlos, had paid him $50,000 to pin the crime on Elena. Rico said it was perfect, Morrison testified, his voice hollow with shame. Carlos's girlfriend, covered in blood, calling 911, he said no jury would look past the obvious suspect to find the real killer. And he was right. But Morrison's confession was only part of the story. The hearing also revealed the role that Judge Michael Cross had played in Elena's wrongful conviction. Elena's original public defender, now a successful attorney in private practice, took the stand to admit his own failures. "I was 26 years old, handling 47 cases at once," he testified. "I met with Elena maybe 3 times before trial. I didn't investigate the gang connections, didn't challenge the physical evidence, didn't even try to present an alternate theory of the crime." But the most damaging testimony came when David presented evidence that Cross had been aware of Carlos's gang connections and Rico Velasquez's involvement in the murder. Cross had buried police reports that identified Rico as a suspect, reports that could have saved Elena from conviction. If you're feeling the same incredible mix of relief and outrage that we are, hit that subscribe button right now, because what happens to Cross next will give you chills. And Elena's reaction when she realizes she's finally free will make you believe in miracles again. Cross, who had watched Morrison's confession from the back of the courtroom, knew that his own downfall was inevitable. 30 years of judicial success, political ambitions, and respect were about to crumble because 4 people had refused to let an injustice stand. Within hours of Morrison's confession, the State Bar Association announced that Cross would face disbarment proceedings. The FBI launched a criminal investigation into his role in Elena's wrongful conviction. The governor's office, which had been considering Cross for a state Supreme Court appointment, released a statement calling his actions a betrayal of public trust. Cross's attempts to plea bargain with federal prosecutors fell on deaf ears. The evidence against him was too overwhelming, the public outrage too intense, and his decades of covering up Elena's innocence too damning for any deal to be possible. The media frenzy was unprecedented. Cable news channels covered the story around the clock, legal experts analyzed every aspect of the case, and social media exploded with support for Elena and condemnation for the system that had failed her. Lisa's documentary, which had been ignored by major platforms just months earlier, was suddenly being featured on every network. Elena's story became more than just a wrongful conviction case. It became a symbol of systemic corruption, of the power of determination, and of the incredible impact that one act of kindness can have across decades. Jenny's articles about Elena's case won her the Pulitzer Prize she had always dreamed of. Tommy, despite losing his police career, was hired by the FBI to help investigate other cases of police corruption. Lisa's documentary was nominated for an Academy Award. David's law firm, instead of punishing him for his involvement in Elena's case, made him a senior partner and created a new division dedicated to overturning wrongful convictions. But the most important victory wasn't professional recognition or career advancement. The most important victory was sitting in a courtroom, listening to Judge Wells speak the words that Elena Rodriguez had been waiting 30 years to hear. In light of the overwhelming evidence of prosecutorial misconduct, police corruption, and new forensic evidence that conclusively excludes the defendant, this court vacates the conviction of Elena Rodriguez. Miss Rodriguez, you are free to go. Elena Rodriguez, who had entered that courtroom as inmate number 47291, walked out as a free woman for the first time since she was 17 years old. 30 years, 2 months, and 14 days after she was wrongfully imprisoned, Elena was finally going home. The 4 friends who had saved her were waiting outside the courtroom, tears streaming down their faces as they saw Elena walk down the courthouse steps as a free woman. David, Jenny, Tommy, and Lisa, the 4 homeless teenagers who had been saved by Elena's kindness, had spent everything they had to return that kindness. The heavy metal doors of Millfield Correctional Facility opened for the final time in Elena Rodriguez's life. After 30 years, 2 months, and 14 days behind bars, Elena stepped into the sunlight as a free woman. She carried nothing but a small bag of personal belongings and the memories of 3 decades stolen from her life. But she wasn't alone. Waiting for her at the prison gates were 4 people she had almost given up hope of ever seeing again. David Thompson, the successful defense attorney who had sacrificed his partnership to fight for her freedom. Jenny Wu, the Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist who had risked her career to expose the truth. Tommy Martinez, the detective who had preserved the evidence that proved her innocence. And Lisa Chen, the documentary filmmaker whose movie had brought Elena's story to the world. 33 years earlier, these 4 had been dirty, desperate teenagers begging for a single shared meal. Now, they were accomplished adults who had used everything they had built to save the woman who had once saved them. Elena looked at their faces, older now, successful, confident, and saw the same eyes that had looked at her with desperate gratitude across a diner counter in 1987. These were her 4 teenagers, grown up and successful, standing before her as the heroes she had never expected to have. The reunion was wordless at first. Elena simply walked into their arms, and the 5 of them stood together outside the prison gates, crying tears that washed away 30 years of pain, injustice, and separation. "I never forgot your faces," Elena whispered through her tears. "Even when I thought I would die in there, I never forgot your faces." David, the boy who had once approached her counter with $3.47, looked at the woman who had shaped his entire life. "You saved us that night. We spent 30 years trying to become worthy of what you gave us. And then we spent everything we had to give it back to you." Jenny, who had built her career on finding truth in the darkness, smiled through her tears. "You taught us that kindness matters, that helping strangers matters, that one person can change everything." Tommy, who had become a police officer because Elena had shown him what justice looked like, shook his head in amazement. "We were just kids, homeless, hungry, hopeless kids, and you saw us as human beings worth saving." Lisa, who had dedicated her art to telling stories of injustice, pulled out a worn sketchbook, the same one she had carried as a teenager. She opened it to a drawing she had made 33 years ago, a sketch of a young waitress with kind eyes and a gentle smile. "I drew this the night you helped us. I've carried it ever since, and I never stopped believing that someday we'd find you again." Elena stared at the drawing, seeing her 17-year-old self reflected back through the eyes of a grateful teenager. "I thought I was just giving you a meal," she said softly. "I had no idea I was giving you your futures." "You gave us more than food that night," David replied. "You gave us hope. You showed us that good people exist in the world. And you inspired each of us to become the kind of person who helps others." 6 months later, Elena Rodriguez sat in a small office in downtown Chicago, reviewing case files of wrongfully convicted prisoners. She had been hired by the Innocence Project to help other people who had suffered the same injustice she had endured. Every day, she worked to free innocent men and women who had been failed by the same system that had stolen 30 years of her life. Elena's new life was simple but meaningful. She lived in a modest apartment filled with plants and sunlight, luxuries she'd been denied for 3 decades. She had learned to use smartphones and computers, marveling at how the world had changed during her imprisonment. She had started therapy to process the trauma of her wrongful conviction, and slowly, carefully, she was learning to trust the world again. But the most precious part of Elena's new life happened once a month. On the last Saturday evening of each month, when she met David, Jenny, Tommy, and Lisa at a small diner not far from where Mel's diner had once stood. The 5 of them always sat in the same booth, and Elena always insisted on serving them herself. She would disappear into the kitchen and emerge with plates piled high with burgers, fries, milkshakes, soup, and pie. The same feast she had given them 33 years ago, when they were hungry teenagers with $3.47. "You don't have to keep feeding us, you know," Lisa would say each month, laughing as Elena set another plate in front of her. "Yes, I do," Elena would reply with a smile that reached her eyes for the first time in decades. "This is how I remember who I used to be. This is how I remember who I want to be again." They would spend hours in that diner, sharing stories about their work, their families, their dreams. David would talk about the wrongfully convicted clients he was helping. Jenny would share the investigative stories she was working on. Tommy, who had started his own private investigation firm specializing in cold cases, would update them on the corrupt cases he was reopening. Lisa would show them clips from her new documentaries about criminal justice reform, and Elena would listen to it all with wonder, realizing that her act of kindness had created not just 4 successful careers, but 4 lifetimes dedicated to helping others. During one of these monthly dinners, as Elena watched her 4 friends laugh and share stories, she reflected on the miracle that had brought them all together again. "You know what I've learned?" Elena said, her voice carrying the wisdom of someone who had lost everything and found it again. "Sometimes the smallest act of kindness creates the biggest miracle. I gave you a meal when you were hungry, and you gave me my life back when I thought it was over forever." Jenny reached across the table and took Elena's hand. "We all saved each other. That's what people do when they love each other." Elena looked around the table at these 4 remarkable people who had refused to let injustice win, who had sacrificed their careers and security to save her, who met with her every month to remember where they had all come from. For the first time in 30 years, Elena Rodriguez smiled, a smile that came from pure, uncomplicated happiness. It was the smile of a woman who had survived the worst the world could do to her, and had been rescued by the best the world had to offer. It was the smile of a woman who had learned that kindness is never wasted, that good deeds echo through time in ways we can never imagine, and that sometimes, when we save others, we end up saving ourselves. Elena Rodriguez had been broken by a corrupt system, abandoned by a society that didn't care about the truth, and forgotten by a world that moved on without her. But she had been remembered by 4 people, whose lives she had touched with a simple act of compassion. And in the end, that was enough to set her free. This incredible true story proves that no act of kindness is ever forgotten, and that sometimes the people we help become the heroes who save us. If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button and share it with someone who needs to believe in the power of human goodness again. What's the smallest act of kindness someone has shown you that changed your life? Tell us in the comments, because every story of kindness deserves to be heard.